Ridgewood was the kind of town that looked perfect on postcards. Nestled between rolling hills and surrounded by thick forests, it had a charm that made people smile when they drove through its quaint streets. The houses were painted in cheerful colors, the local bakery always smelled like fresh bread, and everyone seemed to know each other's names. But beneath this picture-perfect exterior lay secrets hidden behind closed doors, whispered about in hushed tones, and ignored by those who preferred to keep the peace. Sheriff James Callahan was one of the pillars of Ridgewood. A tall man with graying hair and a steady gaze, he had been serving the town for over 2 decades. His badge gleamed proudly on his chest, and his presence commanded respect. People trusted him to keep their families safe, to make sure nothing bad ever happened in their little corner of the world. For most residents, Sheriff Callahan was more than just an authority figure. He was a symbol of stability in a place where life moved slowly and predictably. But not everything was as simple as it seemed. Beneath the surface, Ridgewood was divided. Some of these divisions were subtle, a glance here, a comment there, but others were glaringly obvious. Racism, though rarely spoken of openly, ran deep in certain circles. It wasn't uncommon to hear derogatory remarks muttered under breaths, or see shopkeepers treat customers differently based on the color of their skin. These moments often went unnoticed by outsiders, but for those affected, they left lasting scars. One person who felt the sting of these prejudices more than anyone else was Dr. Anika Patel. She was one of the best doctors at Ridgewood General Hospital, known for her sharp mind, calm demeanor, and unwavering dedication to her patients. Born and raised in India, she had moved to the United States after completing her medical training, bringing with her a wealth of knowledge and experience. Her colleagues admired her work ethic, and her patients adored her compassionate nature. Yet, despite her accomplishments, some people couldn't look past her accent or the color of her skin. Dr. Patel tried not to let these attitudes bother her. She told herself that what mattered most was saving lives, not winning popularity contests. Still, there were days when the weight of prejudice pressed down on her shoulders, like the time a patient refused treatment because she didn't want some foreigner touching her, or the countless occasions when nurses ignored her instructions simply because they didn't believe someone like her could know better than them. Each incident chipped away at her patience, but she never let it show. She stayed focused, determined, to prove herself every single day. While Dr. Patel faced challenges at work, Sheriff Callahan dealt with his own struggles at home. His teenage daughter, Emily, was the light of his life. With her curly brown hair, bright blue eyes, and infectious laugh, she had a way of making even the darkest days seem brighter. Emily was smart, kind, and full of big dreams. She wanted to be a writer someday, filling pages with stories that would inspire others. But lately, she hadn't been herself. She complained of feeling tired all the time, of having headaches and stomach aches that wouldn't go away. At first, Sheriff Callahan brushed it off as typical teenage stress. School was tough, and Emily had been juggling assignments, extracurricular activities, and friendships. He figured she'd bounce back soon enough. That changed one evening when Emily collapsed in the living room. One moment she was sitting on the couch watching TV, and the next she was on the floor clutching her stomach and crying out in pain. Panic surged through Sheriff Callahan as he rushed to her side. "Emily, sweetheart, what's wrong?" He asked, his voice trembling. She could barely speak, tears streaming down her face as she gasped for air. Without wasting another second, he scooped her up into his arms and carried her to the car. The drive to Ridgewood General Hospital felt like an eternity. Every red light seemed impossibly long, every turn agonizingly slow. Sheriff Callahan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with worry. Memories of Emily flooded his mind, their weekend hikes, the bedtime stories he used to read her, the way she lit up whenever she talked about her future. He couldn't lose her, not now, not ever. When they finally arrived at the hospital, the emergency room staff sprang into action. Dr. Patel was paged immediately, and within minutes she was assessing Emily's condition. After a quick examination, she delivered the diagnosis: a ruptured appendix. It was serious but not hopeless, if treated promptly. Surgery was needed right away to prevent complications like infection or sepsis. Dr. Patel wasted no time preparing. The operating room, her movements efficient and precise. She knew how critical speed was in cases like this. As the preparations began, however, tension started brewing among the hospital staff. Nurse Margaret, a middle-aged woman with a sour expression, muttered something under her breath about outsiders being put in charge. Her words caught the attention of Deputy Frank Hargrove, who had just walked into the hospital. Hargrove was one of Sheriff Callahan's subordinates, a burly man with a reputation for arrogance and intolerance. He had always resented Dr. Patel, viewing her success as a threat to the status quo. To him, someone like her didn't belong in a position of authority, not in Ridgewood anyway. Hargrove approached the surgical team, his presence commanding and intimidating. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his tone laced with suspicion. When he learned that Dr. Patel was leading the operation, he scoffed loudly. "We can't trust this to just anyone," he said, glancing pointedly at her. "Let's wait for someone more qualified." His implication hung heavy in the air, sending ripples of unease through the room. For a moment, everything froze. Dr. Patel met Hargrove's gaze, her jaw tightening slightly. She knew exactly what he meant, and why he was saying it. But she also knew that arguing with him would only waste precious time. Instead, she turned to Sheriff Callahan, who stood nearby looking torn between trusting his deputy and believing in the doctor standing before him. "Sheriff," Dr. Patel said firmly, "your daughter needs surgery now. Every minute counts. If we delay, the consequences could be fatal." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Yet as much as he wanted to believe her, doubt crept in. Was she truly the best person for the job? Could he afford to take the risk? As he hesitated, Hargrove seized the opportunity to push harder, insisting that they bring in another surgeon from a neighboring town. And so, against all logic and urgency, the decision was made to wait, for someone else to arrive, for someone else to save Emily's life. The hospital buzzed with a tense energy as Emily was wheeled into the emergency room. Her pale face and labored breathing sent waves of panic through everyone present, especially Sheriff Callahan. He stood frozen for a moment, watching his daughter, being hooked up to machines that beeped and blinked with alarming urgency. The once lively girl who used to laugh so freely now lay motionless, her body racked with pain. It felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Dr. Annika Patel moved swiftly, her calm demeanor masking the gravity of the situation. She had seen countless patients in critical condition, but this time was different. This wasn't just another case. It was the sheriff's daughter, the heart of Ridgewood's most beloved family. As she examined Emily, Dr. Patel's mind raced through possibilities. Her instincts screamed at her, ruptured appendix. If left untreated, it could lead to sepsis, organ failure, and death. There was no time to waste. She turned to the nurses around her and began issuing orders. "We need to prep her for surgery immediately," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Get the operating room ready and make sure we have everything we'll need." The nurses nodded, scurrying to follow her instructions. Some hesitated momentarily, exchanging uneasy glances, but Dr. Patel didn't notice, or perhaps she chose not to acknowledge it. She had learned long ago to focus on what mattered, saving lives. As the preparations continued, Deputy Frank Hargrove entered the scene. His arrival was sudden and jarring, like a storm cloud rolling over an otherwise clear sky. Hargrove strode into the hospital with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. His heavy boots echoed against the tiled floor, drawing attention from both staff and visitors alike. He scanned the room quickly, his sharp eyes landing on Sheriff Callahan first before shifting toward Dr. Patel. "What's happening here?" Hargrove barked, his voice loud enough to carry across the entire ER. Nurses paused mid-step, unsure whether to answer or retreat. Dr. Patel looked up briefly, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything, letting one of the younger nurses explain the situation instead. "It's Sheriff Callahan's daughter," the nurse stammered nervously. "She collapsed at home. Dr. Patel thinks she has a ruptured appendix and needs emergency surgery. Hargrove frowned, his lips curling into a sneer as his gaze settled on Dr. Patel. You think? He repeated mockingly, emphasizing the word as if questioning her competence. Shouldn't we wait for someone more experienced? Someone who actually knows what they're doing? The comment hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Dr. Patel clenched her jaw but kept her composure. She had heard such remarks before, though rarely so openly hostile. Still, she refused to let him derail her focus. Deputy Hargrove, she replied coolly, I assure you, I am fully qualified to handle this procedure. Waiting will only increase the risk to Emily's life. Hargrove scoffed, folding his arms across his chest. Qualified doesn't mean capable, he shot back. You hear about these things all the time. Foreign doctors messing up surgeries because they don't understand our standards. His words struck a nerve, not just with Dr. Patel but with others in the room as well. A few nurses exchanged uncomfortable looks, while Sheriff Callahan shifted awkwardly where he stood. Part of him wanted to defend Dr. Patel, to tell Hargrove that she was one of the best doctors in the county. But another part of him, the part clouded by doubt and fear, hesitated. What if Hargrove was right? What if waiting really was the safer option? Before anyone could respond, Nurse Margaret chimed in, her tone dripping with thinly veiled disdain. Maybe we should call Dr. Thompson, she suggested, referring to a white surgeon who worked at a nearby hospital. He's closer than you'd think, and he's got years of experience under his belt. The suggestion seemed innocent enough, but its implications were clear. Dr. Patel recognized the underlying message, you're not good enough. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain professional. Calling in another doctor will delay the surgery significantly, she explained patiently. Emily doesn't have hours to spare. Minutes matter in cases like this. Despite her reasoning, the damage was already done. Hargrove seized the opportunity to assert his influence, turning to Sheriff Callahan for support. Sheriff, this is your daughter we're talking about, he said, his tone dripping with false concern. Do you really want to leave her fate in the hands of someone who might not be up to the task? We can't afford to take chances here. Callahan flinched at the question, guilt gnawing at him. He trusted Dr. Patel, he truly did, but the weight of responsibility was crushing him. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and the pressure to make the right decision was overwhelming. Hargrove's words planted seeds of doubt in his mind, making him question whether he was prioritizing his faith in Dr. Patel over his duty to protect Emily. I need a moment, Callahan muttered finally, stepping away from the group. He leaned against the wall, running a hand through his graying hair as conflicting thoughts swirled in his head. On one side there was Dr. Patel, whose expertise and quick thinking had saved countless lives. On the other, there was Hargrove's insistence on waiting for someone else, a choice that seemed safer, even if it meant losing precious time. While Callahan wrestled with his conscience, the tension in the room grew palpable. Nurses whispered nervously among themselves, torn between following protocol and placating Hargrove. Dr. Patel, meanwhile, tried to stay focused on preparing for the surgery, though her frustration simmered just beneath the surface. She knew that every second wasted debating her qualifications put Emily at greater risk. Yet, she also understood that challenging Hargrove directly would likely escalate the situation further. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Callahan returned to the group. His shoulders sagged with uncertainty, and his voice wavered as he spoke. Let's call Dr. Thompson, he said quietly, avoiding eye contact with Dr. Patel, just to be safe. The decision hit Dr. Patel like a punch to the gut. For a brief moment, she considered arguing, pleading with Callahan to reconsider. But seeing the defeat etched on his face, she realized it was futile. Instead, she nodded silently, retreating to the sidelines as arrangements were made to bring in the other surgeon. As she stepped away, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness, not just for Emily, but for the system that allowed prejudice to override reason. Meanwhile, Hargrove wore a smug expression, clearly pleased with himself for getting his way. He patted Callahan on the back, offering hollow reassurances about how they were doing the right thing. But even as he basked in his perceived victory, the clock continued ticking. And with each passing minute, Emily's chances of survival slipped further away. The minutes dragged on like hours as the hospital staff scrambled to contact Dr. Thompson, the surgeon Deputy Hargrove had insisted upon. The delay was agonizing for everyone involved, but none more so than Sheriff Callahan, who paced back and forth in the hallway outside the emergency room. His boots clicked against the tiled floor with each heavy step, echoing his growing anxiety. Every beep from the machines monitoring Emily's condition felt like a countdown to something irreversible. He clenched and unclenched his fists, trying to steady himself, but the guilt gnawing at him made it impossible to find peace. Inside the ER, Dr. Anika Patel stood silently, her arms crossed over her chest as she watched the chaos unfold around her. Her mind raced with frustration and helplessness. She knew exactly what needed to be done, what should have been done already. But her expertise had been sidelined by prejudice and fear. The nurses avoided making eye contact with her, their movements hesitant and unsure. Some whispered among themselves, casting furtive glances toward Deputy Hargrove, whose presence loomed large in the room. His smug demeanor only fueled the tension, as if he were daring anyone to challenge his authority. Hargrove, for his part, seemed entirely unfazed by the urgency of the situation. He leaned casually against the wall near the entrance, arms folded, occasionally glancing at his phone as though this were just another routine day at work. When a nurse approached him to ask about coordinating with Dr. Thompson, he waved her off dismissively. "Just do your job," he muttered, not bothering to look up. To him, this wasn't about saving a life. It was about asserting control, proving that people like Dr. Patel didn't belong in positions of power. As the wait stretched on, whispers of dissent began to ripple through the staff. Nurse Margaret, who had initially sided with Hargrove, started to show signs of unease. She glanced at Emily lying unconscious on the gurney, her breathing shallow and uneven, and bit her lip nervously. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" she asked one of her colleagues quietly, careful to keep her voice low enough that Hargrove wouldn't overhear. The other nurse hesitated before responding. "I don't know," she admitted, shaking her head. "But I've seen Dr. Patel handle cases way worse than this. She's never once messed up. Not once." Their conversation went unnoticed by most, drowned out by the hum of activity in the room. But Dr. Patel caught fragments of it, and though she appreciated the quiet support, it did little to ease her frustration. What good were whispers of validation when they came too late? Time was slipping away and every second counted. Yet, no matter how much she wanted to intervene, to remind everyone of the stakes, she knew speaking up now would only escalate the conflict and potentially harm Emily further. Meanwhile, Sheriff Callahan continued to wrestle with his decision. Each time he replayed the events in his mind, he found himself questioning whether he'd made the right call. Had he let his trust in Hargrove override his faith in Dr. Patel? Or had he simply been paralyzed by fear, unable to make a firm choice when it mattered most? The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, suffocating and relentless. He thought about Emily, the way she used to laugh during family dinners, the way her eyes sparkled whenever she talked about her dreams of becoming a writer. How could he face her mother if something happened to their daughter? How could he live with himself? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching from down the hall. A young intern burst into the room, clutching a clipboard. "Dr. Thompson is on his way," the intern announced breathlessly. "He'll be here in 20 minutes. 20 minutes, it might as well have been 20 years. Dr. Patel exhaled sharply, her jaw tightening as she processed the news. She shot a glance at Emily, whose vitals were beginning to fluctuate dangerously. Her heart rate was rising and her blood pressure was dropping, a clear sign that infection was setting in. If they waited much longer, the damage could become irreversible. Unable to stay silent any longer, Dr. Patel stepped forward, addressing the group directly. "This delay is putting Emily's life at significant risk," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise. Her condition is deteriorating rapidly. Waiting for Dr. Thompson may mean waiting too long. Her words drew mixed reactions. Some of the nurses nodded in agreement, while others looked away uncomfortably. Hargrove, however, rolled his eyes, dramatically. "Oh, come on," he scoffed. "You're just upset because someone else is coming in to save the day. Don't take it personally, Doc." The comment stung, but Dr. Patel refused to let it rattle her. Instead, she turned to Sheriff Callahan, appealing to him directly. "Sheriff," she said, her tone measured but urgent, "I understand your concerns, but please consider the facts. Every minute counts in a case like this. By the time Dr. Thompson arrives, it may already be too late." Callahan stared at her, torn between gratitude for her persistence and anger at himself for creating this mess. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, Hargrove interjected again. "Look, Sheriff," he said, stepping closer and lowering his voice slightly, though not enough to avoid being heard. "You can't afford to gamble with your daughter's life. Trust me, we're doing the right thing here. Let Dr. Thompson handle it. That's what's best for everyone." "Best for everyone," Dr. Patel repeated incredulously, unable to hold back any longer. "Or best for you? Because delaying this surgery isn't helping Emily. It's hurting her. And if something happens to her, you'll have to live with that on your conscience." The room fell silent. Even the machines monitoring Emily's vitals seemed quieter, as if the entire space was holding its breath. Hargrove's face reddened with indignation, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glared at Dr. Patel, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, but then he forced a tight smile, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "You're out of line, Doctor," he said coldly. "Stick to your job and leave the decisions to those who actually know what they're doing." Dr. Patel met his gaze without flinching, her expression calm but resolute. She didn't need to say anything more. Her silence spoke volumes. Around them, the tension thickened, almost unbearable. Nurses exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do or say. Even Sheriff Callahan looked conflicted, his loyalty to his deputy warring with his instinct to trust Dr. Patel. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the distant sound of sirens signaled Dr. Thompson's arrival. The relief in the room was palpable, though tinged with apprehension. As the paramedics wheeled him into the hospital, Dr. Patel stepped aside, allowing him to take charge. She watched silently as he assessed Emily's condition, issuing orders and directing the team with practiced efficiency. Despite everything, she couldn't help but admire his skill, even if his presence came far too late. But deep down, she knew the truth. The damage had already been done. The delay caused by Hargrove's interference had cost them precious time that could have made all the difference. As Dr. Thompson prepared Emily for surgery, Dr. Patel lingered in the corner of the room, her arms still crossed over her chest. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes told a different story, one of sadness, frustration, and quiet determination. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about the systemic issues that allowed prejudice to dictate outcomes, even in matters of life and death. And as the operating room doors swung shut behind Dr. Thompson, Dr. Patel turned and walked away, leaving behind a scene that would haunt her and everyone else involved for years to come. The operating room buzzed with a flurry of activity as Dr. Thompson and his team worked tirelessly to save Emily's life. The delay caused by Deputy Hargrove's interference had already taken its toll, and the signs were unmistakable. Emily's vitals were unstable, her body fighting against the infection that had begun spreading through her bloodstream. Sepsis, a deadly complication of an untreated ruptured appendix, was setting in rapidly. Each passing second felt heavier than the last, as though time itself were conspiring against them. Dr. Thompson was no stranger to high-pressure situations. A seasoned surgeon with decades of experience, he moved with practiced precision, barking orders at the nurses while keeping a close eye on Emily's monitors. Yet even he couldn't ignore the grim reality of the situation. "Her organs are starting to shut down," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head slightly as he adjusted the surgical instruments in his hands. This is going to be tough. Outside the operating room, Sheriff Callahan sat slumped in a chair in the waiting area, his face buried in his hands. He hadn't moved much since Dr. Thompson arrived, unable to shake the gnawing sense of guilt that consumed him. Every beep from the machines inside the OR echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the choices he'd made or failed to make. His thoughts spiraled endlessly, replaying the events leading up to this moment. Why had he listened to Hargrove? Why hadn't he trusted Dr. Patel when it mattered most? Deputy Frank Hargrove, on the other hand, seemed oddly unfazed by the gravity of the situation. He stood near the entrance of the waiting area, leaning casually against the wall as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Occasionally, he glanced at his phone or exchanged hushed words with one of the officers who had accompanied him to the hospital. To anyone watching, he appeared calm and composed, but beneath his smug exterior lay a simmering arrogance, a belief that his actions had been justified, even heroic. Sheriff Callahan noticed Hargrove's demeanor and felt a surge of anger rise within him. How could the man act so nonchalant when Emily's life hung precariously in the balance? But before he could confront him, a nurse emerged from the operating room, her expression somber. She approached Callahan cautiously, her voice soft but firm. "Sheriff, we're doing everything we can," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "But it's not looking good." Callahan nodded numbly, his throat tightening as tears welled up in his eyes. He wanted to ask questions. How bad was it? Was there still hope? But the words refused to come out. Instead, he simply stared at the floor, clutching the brim of his hat so tightly that his knuckles turned white. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless. Inside the operating room, the battle to save Emily intensified. Dr. Thompson worked methodically, attempting to repair the damage caused by the delayed surgery. He suctioned away infected fluid, patched the ruptured appendix, and administered antibiotics directly into her system. Despite his best efforts, however, the infection continued to spread. Her blood pressure plummeted dangerously low, and her heart rate spiked erratically. The anesthesia team struggled to keep her stable, their voices tense as they called out readings and adjustments. "We're losing her," one of the nurses shouted suddenly, breaking the tense silence. Dr. Thompson didn't respond verbally. Instead, he redoubled his efforts, moving faster and with greater urgency. Sweat dripped from his brow as he fought to stave off the inevitable. "Come on, kid," he muttered under his breath, his tone a mix of determination and desperation. "Don't give up on me now." For several agonizing minutes, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of hurried movements and mechanical beeps. Then finally, the monitors began to stabilize ever so slightly. Emily's heart rate slowed and her blood pressure inched upward. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was enough to offer a glimmer of hope. Dr. Thompson let out a long, weary sigh, wiping his forehead with the back of his gloved hand. "Okay," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Let's finish this." Meanwhile, outside the OR, the tension among those waiting grew unbearable. Dr. Anika Patel lingered nearby, having refused to leave despite being sidelined earlier. She sat quietly in a corner, her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze fixed on the closed doors of the operating room. Though she tried to remain stoic, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't help but think about how different things might have been if she had been allowed to operate immediately. Would Emily still be fighting for her life right now? Or would she already be recovering, safe and sound? As the hours dragged on, word began to spread throughout the hospital about what was happening. Nurses whispered nervously in corridors. Doctors paused mid-rounds to check on updates, and visitors strained to catch glimpses of the unfolding drama. Ridgewood General Hospital, usually a place of quiet efficiency, had become a stage for something far more profound, a tragedy born not of accident or illness alone, but of prejudice and poor judgment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the operating room doors swung open. Dr. Thompson emerged, his scrubs stained with blood, his face etched with fatigue. He removed his mask and ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply before addressing the anxious crowd gathered in the hallway. "We did everything we could," he began, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "But the infection had progressed. Too far. We weren't able to reverse the damage." A collective gasp rippled through the group, followed by stunned silence. Sheriff Callahan rose slowly from his seat, his legs trembling beneath him. What does that mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Thompson hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I'm sorry, Sheriff," he said finally. "Emily passed away during surgery. There was nothing more we could do." The room seemed to freeze in that moment, as if the air itself had been sucked out. Callahan staggered backward, collapsing, into his chair as the full weight of the news hit him. Tears streamed down his face unchecked, and he covered his mouth with both hands to muffle a sob. Around him, others reacted in their own ways. Some cried openly, others looked away, unable to bear the sight of such raw grief. Even Hargrove, who had remained aloof until now, shifted uncomfortably, his usual bravado faltering. Dr. Patel watched silently, her heart aching for the shattered family and the young girl whose life had been cut tragically short. She knew that Emily's death wasn't just a medical failure, it was a failure of humanity. Prejudice and fear had cost this town one of its brightest lights, and the consequences would ripple far beyond these hospital walls. As the reality of Emily's passing settled over everyone, the atmosphere in the hallway shifted. Grief gave way to anger, and whispers of blame began to circulate. Nurses shot accusatory glances at Hargrove, whose earlier insistence on delaying the surgery now seemed indefensible. Even some of the officers who had supported him earlier began to distance themselves, sensing the storm that was brewing. Sheriff Callahan, overwhelmed by emotion, struggled to process what had happened. He thought about all the moments he'd taken for granted, the laughter, the hugs, the simple joys of being a father, and realized with crushing clarity that he'd never experience them again. And as he sat there, broken and devastated, he couldn't help but wonder, could I have saved her? The news of Emily's death spread like wildfire through Ridgewood, igniting shock, sorrow, and outrage in equal measure. The town that prided itself on its charm and close-knit community was now grappling with a tragedy that exposed its deepest flaws. By morning, whispers had turned into heated conversations at coffee shops, schools, and grocery stores. Everyone had something to say about what had happened, about the choices made, the delays endured, and the prejudices that had played a role in sealing Emily's fate. Sheriff James Callahan became the center of attention, not as the respected leader he once was, but as the grieving father whose indecision may have cost his daughter her life. He retreated into himself after leaving the hospital, unable to face anyone, not even his wife, who blamed him outright for trusting Deputy Hargrove over Dr. Patel. "You let them take control," she screamed during one particularly painful argument. "You stood there and did nothing while they wasted precious time." Her words cut deeper than any knife ever could, leaving Callahan drowning in guilt and regret. For days he avoided going to work, locking himself in his study and staring blankly at old photos of Emily. Each image felt like a punch to the gut, a reminder of everything he'd lost and everything he couldn't undo. His badge, which had once symbolized strength and authority, now sat untouched on his desk, gathering dust. He barely ate or slept, haunted by visions of Emily lying motionless on the operating table. What hurt most wasn't just the loss of his daughter. It was knowing that her death might have been preventable if only he'd acted differently. Deputy Frank Hargrove, meanwhile, found himself at the center of growing scrutiny. At first, he tried to deflect blame, insisting that his actions were meant to protect Emily by ensuring the best care possible. But as more details emerged about how he had openly questioned Dr. Patel's competence and delayed the surgery, public opinion began to turn against him. Nurses at the hospital started speaking out, recounting moments when Hargrove's prejudice had influenced decisions or intimidated staff. One nurse revealed how he had mocked Dr. Patel's accent during a previous incident, calling her Doctor Google behind her back because of her foreign-sounding name. Another recounted how he had pressured doctors to prioritize white patients over others, citing community standards. These revelations sparked outrage among residents, many of whom demanded accountability. Community leaders called for an investigation into Hargrove's conduct, accusing him of abusing his power and perpetuating systemic racism within the department. Protesters gathered outside the sheriff's office, holding signs that read, "Justice for Emily and end racism now." Some even showed up at Hargrove's home shouting accusations and demanding his resignation. For the first time in his career, Hargrove faced consequences for his behavior. But instead of admitting fault, he doubled down, claiming he was being unfairly targeted. "I didn't do anything wrong," he told reporters during a brief press conference, flanked by a few loyal officers. "I was just doing my job, making sure we followed protocol. If people want to twist this into something, it's not fine. But I won't apologize for trying to keep our town safe." His defense fell flat, however, as evidence mounted against him. Dr. Anika Patel, who had initially stayed silent out of professionalism, decided to speak publicly after consulting with colleagues and friends. Standing before a crowd of reporters outside the hospital, she recounted the events leading up to Emily's surgery, emphasizing the critical importance of timely medical intervention. "Every second counts in cases like this," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of emotion behind her words. "Delaying treatment even by minutes can mean the difference between life and death. And yet, when I tried to act, I was dismissed because of who I am." Her statement resonated deeply with many in Ridgewood, especially those who had long felt marginalized by the town's hidden biases. People rallied around her, praising her courage and calling for systemic change. Letters of support poured in from across the county, thanking her for shining a light on the pervasive racism that often went unchallenged. Even some of Hargrove's former allies began distancing themselves, realizing the tide had shifted irreversibly. As the fallout continued, Sheriff Callahan wrestled with his own role in the tragedy. Though consumed by grief, he knew he couldn't remain passive any longer. After days of isolation, he finally emerged from his house, determined to seek justice for Emily, not just for her sake, but for the sake of everyone affected by similar injustices. He called an emergency meeting with his senior deputies, vowing to launch an internal investigation into Hargrove's actions. "We need to get to the truth," he declared, his voice trembling with emotion. "No matter where it leads." The decision marked a turning point for Callahan, both personally and professionally. It wasn't easy. Facing the reality of his failures required immense humility, but he understood that accountability was the first step toward healing. He also recognized that punishing Hargrove alone wouldn't fix the larger problem. Ridgewood's issues ran deeper than one prejudiced deputy. They were rooted in decades of unchecked bias and privilege. To truly honor Emily's memory, he realized, he needed to address these systemic flaws head-on. In the weeks that followed, the town underwent a painful reckoning. Community forums were organized to discuss racism and inequality, drawing hundreds of attendees eager to share their experiences and propose solutions. Local schools introduced programs aimed at fostering inclusivity, while businesses pledged to hire more diverse staff. Even the hospital implemented new policies to ensure that all patients received equitable care, regardless of race or background. These changes weren't perfect. They couldn't bring Emily back, but they represented a glimmer of hope amid the darkness. Through it all, Dr. Patel remained a steadfast advocate for reform. She continued working tirelessly at Ridgewood General, treating patients with the same compassion and dedication that had always defined her. Though she still encountered resistance from some quarters, she refused to let fear dictate her actions. Instead, she channeled her energy into mentoring young medical professionals, encouraging them to stand firm in the face of adversity. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she often reminded her mentees, "but every small step matters." For Sheriff Callahan, the road ahead was fraught with challenges. Rebuilding trust within his department and with the community would take time. Yet as he stood before a memorial erected in Emily's name near the hospital entrance, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The plaque bore a simple inscription, "In loving memory of Emily Callahan, whose light will guide us toward a better future." Callahan traced the words with his fingers, tears streaming down his face. He knew he would carry the weight of his mistakes for the rest of his life, but he also vowed to use that burden as fuel for change. Emily's death had shattered his world, but it had also awakened something within him, a determination to fight for a Ridgewood where no family would suffer, as his had. The weeks turned into months, and Ridgewood slowly began to transform. It wasn't an overnight change, nothing so drastic or miraculous, but rather a series of small, deliberate steps that signaled the town's collective effort to confront its past and build a better future. The tragedy of Emily Callahan's death had left an indelible mark on everyone who called Ridgewood home, forcing them to reckon with truths they had long ignored. For some, it was a painful awakening. For others, it was a chance to grow. Either way, the seeds of change were planted, and though they would take time to bloom, their roots ran deep. Sheriff James Callahan emerged as an unlikely leader in this movement for reform. Once paralyzed by guilt and grief, he now channeled his pain into action, determined to honor Emily's memory by ensuring that no one else would suffer because of prejudice or negligence. He started by overhauling his department, implementing strict anti-discrimination policies and requiring all officers to undergo sensitivity training. These measures weren't popular with everyone. Some deputies grumbled about political correctness and unnecessary bureaucracy. But Callahan stood firm. "I didn't do my job when it mattered most," he admitted during a town hall meeting, his voice thick with emotion. "I let fear and doubt cloud my judgment, and it cost me everything. I won't make that mistake again. Not with your trust, not with your safety." His honesty resonated with many residents, earning him back some of the respect he had lost. People saw a man willing to confront his flaws, to acknowledge his failures, publicly, and to work tirelessly to prevent similar tragedies. Slowly but surely, the rift between him and the community began to heal. Even his wife, though still grieving deeply, found solace in seeing her husband fight for something greater than himself. Together, they visited Emily's memorial often, leaving flowers and sharing stories about her life. Each visit brought a little more peace, a reminder that while Emily was gone, her legacy lived on. Deputy Frank Hargrove, on the other hand, faced a very different fate. The internal investigation into his conduct revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior that went far beyond the night of Emily's death. Multiple complaints surfaced from colleagues and civilians alike, detailing incidents of racial profiling, verbal abuse, and intimidation. When confronted with the evidence, Hargrove initially denied everything, accusing the investigators of bias and fabricating charges against him. But as witness after witness came forward, his defenses crumbled. Ultimately, Hargrove was suspended, without pay pending further disciplinary action, and rumors circulated that criminal charges might follow. His removal from the force sent shockwaves through Ridgewood, dividing opinions once again. Some celebrated the decision, viewing it as a long overdue reckoning for a man whose arrogance had caused irreparable harm. Others defended him, clinging to outdated beliefs about tradition and authority. Despite the backlash, however, Hargrove's influence waned significantly. Stripped of his badge and stripped of his power, he became a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when hatred goes unchecked. Dr. Annika Patel, meanwhile, rose to prominence as a beacon of resilience and hope. Her courage in speaking out about the systemic racism she had faced inspired countless people, both within Ridgewood and beyond. Local news outlets featured her story, highlighting her dedication to patient care and her unwavering commitment to equality. Schools invited her to speak at assemblies, where she shared messages of perseverance and inclusivity with students. And at Ridgewood General Hospital, her advocacy led to tangible improvements: mandatory diversity workshops for staff, clearer protocols for emergency situations, and increased transparency in decision-making processes. Yet, despite the newfound recognition, Dr. Patel remained humble. She never sought praise or accolades. Her focus was always on the work itself, on saving lives and making healthcare accessible to everyone, regardless of background. To her, Emily's death served as a stark reminder of the stakes involved. Every patient she treated afterward carried a piece of Emily's spirit, urging her to keep pushing forward, to keep fighting for justice. The hospital played a pivotal role in Ridgewood's transformation, becoming a hub for education and awareness. In collaboration with local organizations, it hosted seminars on cultural competency and implicit bias, drawing participants from across the county. One particularly impactful event featured a panel discussion with Dr. Patel, Sheriff Callahan, and several community leaders. They spoke candidly about their experiences, addressing uncomfortable truths while offering solutions for moving forward. The turnout exceeded expectations, with attendees spilling into overflow rooms and participating via livestream. One attendee, a young nurse named Sarah, summed up the sentiment perfectly during the Q&A session. "For years I stayed silent because I was afraid of rocking the boat," she confessed, her voice trembling with vulnerability. "But hearing all of you talk tonight made me realize that staying silent is part of the problem. We can't be afraid to stand up for what's right, even if it means challenging those in power." Her words echoed throughout the auditorium, met with thunderous applause. It was a moment of unity, of shared purpose, a glimpse of the brighter future Ridgewood was striving toward. As the seasons changed, so too did the town itself. New murals appeared on downtown buildings, celebrating diversity and inclusion. Community gardens sprouted up in vacant lots, tended by volunteers from all walks of life. Conversations that once centered around gossip and trivialities shifted toward meaningful discussions about equity and empathy. Even Deputy Hargrove's vacant position was filled by Officer Marcus Chen, a young Asian American recruit whose presence signaled progress. Still, challenges remained. Old habits die hard, and there were moments when tensions flared, reminders that change is rarely linear. But each obstacle only strengthened the resolve of those committed to building a better Ridgewood. They leaned on each other, drawing strength from their shared mission. And whenever doubt crept in, they looked to Emily's memorial for inspiration. On the anniversary of her passing, hundreds gathered at the site to pay tribute. Sheriff Callahan delivered a heartfelt speech, thanking everyone who had worked alongside him to create positive change. "Emily taught us how precious life is," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "She reminded us that love and kindness should guide our actions, not fear or prejudice. Let's continue honoring her by being the kind of people she believed we could be." As the crowd dispersed, Dr. Patel lingered behind, placing a single, white rose at the base of the plaque. She stood there for a moment, gazing at the inscription before whispering softly, "Thank you, Emily." Then, with a renewed sense of purpose, she turned and walked away, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Ridgewood wasn't perfect, it likely never would be, but it was learning to listen, to empathize, to grow. And in doing so, it proved that even the deepest wounds can become catalysts for healing, if